Hello, welcome to End or N-Gauge Model Railway. Having got to a point with the textures and structure of my tunnel portal that I was happy with, it was time to varnish it to protect it. I'd already bought some AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish because that's what Michael uses on Chandwell to great effect, and rewatched one of his videos called The Cube of Truth to see how much to apply. In that, he says he's found the Ultra Matte Varnish is quite runny and can cause ink to run a bit, so he uses the thicker matte varnish first and then finishes with the Ultra Matte. I'd forgotten that, so ordered some AK Interactive Matte Varnish, and while waiting for that to arrive, tried the Ultra Matte on a test area of the portal. I didn't have any problems with ink running or smudging, but after a while some of the texture had started to peel off a bit, so it does seem to affect the PVA glue in my case. It did have a very good matte effect though. There wasn't any sheen in the area I'd covered. After the matte varnish arrived, I applied that to a test area too. Again, there weren't any issues with ink running, but even once dry it does leave a very obvious sheen. It also seemed to cause a similar peeling at the edge of the texture as the Ultra Matte had, but I decided there was nothing to lose in proceeding with a full coat of it. Because it was thicker and more viscous, it left a texture with the brush strokes, so I had to do a lot more brushing to try and smooth it all out. Even then, once dry, it did leave an obvious texture. It also caused the wing wall to warp where it wasn't braced, like PVA had when applying textures, so I'll need to take that into account in the future. The varnish is a lot more expensive than glue, so I don't really want to paint both sides of everything. After a coat of Ultra Matte varnish, there was still a sheen to the surface, so I applied a second layer much more liberally. Even after just a few minutes, that was looking much better. There doesn't seem to have been any benefit to having the matte varnish layer, only the downside of the texture it leaves, so next time I'll just do 2 coats of Ultra Matte and see how that goes. Tunnel portals usually have streaks of efflorescence running down them, but tunnels nowadays are 90 to 100 years older than the period I'm aiming to model, so I had a look through photos in various books to get a feel for what they looked like in steam days. I didn't see that any looked this way, they just looked a little dirty, so I decided not to paint any white streaks on, and would just add a bit of general weathering at some point in the future. Instead, next up was integration of the portal into the land. I spent a little while deciding where I'd like the portal to sit, and then excavated space for its left wing wall and the bracing pieces along its back. Using some Mark III coaches to check for clearance, I refined the position of the portal, shaving off little bits of land as necessary. But then I changed my mind a bit. I realised I needed a bit of fixed land between the portal and the removable section of land in order to get a reasonable join and to avoid damaging the fragile portal in future, so I moved it forwards a bit. I briefly tried cutting some card to the shape of the gap between the portal and removable land, but it was far too flimsy. Instead, I trimmed the edge of the removable land to make it much straighter, both vertically and horizontally. I then found a large enough scrap of foam and on my second attempt cut a suitable shape from it, glued it in place, and before the glue started to set made sure the removable section could still lift out. The relocation of the portal meant that the earlier excavations in the land now left too much of a gap, so I cut scraps of foam to fill the largest holes, and then more to form the bulk of the remaining land that leads into the main hill. Once the foam bits were glued in place, I did a few rounds of trimming to blend the shapes into existing land and up to the tunnel portal, until I was happy with how it looked. It was a little tricky trying to get these shapes just right while the portal could move, so I decided now would be the best time to glue it in place, so I doused its edges in PVA and wiped off the excess. Before all that glue dried, I did a final check for clearance with trains while it was still possible to make adjustments. After seeing a bit of glue drip down onto the tracks, I cut a cover for the rails, which would be necessary for the next stage anyway. I was too impatient to wait until the next day for glue to dry, and free weekends are too scarce to waste, so 10 minutes later I proceeded to what is now my standard second layer approach, cheap toilet roll soaked in plaster. With some protection in place for the wall, I used the toilet roll and plaster to fill medium-sized gaps and give a smoother overall shape to the land. Since I'd be covering this in multiple layers of scatter later, I didn't worry too much about getting a very smooth finish. Free time didn't last as long as I'd thought it would, and it wasn't until the next day I did the same again at the other side of the portal. I do actually have standard masking tape and some Tamiya tape as well, but I didn't know where, so proceeded without any on the portal because I thought any spills could be gently rubbed off thanks to the varnish. That did generally hold true, but there was one patch in particular where I thought I was spreading the spilled plaster around and kept at it. But on closer inspection, I found the top layer of texture was rubbing off. It looks like some other areas were also damaged. So 3 layers of varnish don't provide lots of protection. I'll need to try touching up those areas with some paint later on. A couple of days later, I wanted to fill remaining gaps with filler and would clearly need to use masking tape to avoid further damage to the portal. It took literally a few seconds to find, so I really should have actually tried looking for it before applying the toilet roll and plaster. I mixed a small amount of filler and used it both to fill gaps and to do a little bit of smoothing. Before it set, I removed the masking tape, but there were still some gaps. There must have been too much of an overhang of masking tape. I decided it would be best to let this layer dry before trying another round of tape and filler. The next day, I masked off the area even more precisely and mixed up an even smaller amount of filler and filled those gaps. Although they were small, it wasn't much effort to try and plug them, which would also have the benefit of stopping glue and scatter from seeping through later on. It wasn't very long before that was dry, so later that day I covered the whole area in PVA glue. Much more than I'd intended to, because a large glob came out of the bottle unexpectedly, and then applied a first layer of scatter. I needed to remove the masking tape while the glue was still wet, but in one place some glue had got under the tape, so I did my best to wipe that off along with the bits of scatter that had fallen on it when the tape was pulled up. After I stopped filming, I pressed some scatter on by hand into a few areas where scatter hadn't settled, mainly along the joints to the portal walls. The next day I vacuumed up scatter that hadn't stuck, which revealed some had stuck on top of the portal stonework, and some had failed to stick right next to the portal. I don't mind a little bit of scatter overlapping the portal, but the photos I saw of portals back in the steam days were not swamped with overgrowth. The railways and their land were much better maintained back then, so for a 20s or 30s look tunnel portals should be clear of greenery. Fortunately, the excess scatter came off quite easily without damaging the paper texture. For the areas that were still bare to plaster, I added a small amount of glue. To start with, I was trying to be very precise, but soon remembered I could just wipe excess glue and scatter off before the glue dried, so it wasn't hard to try fixing these areas. As I record this, that latest bit of glue is still drying, and I want to leave it to dry for a long time before vacuuming it. But even so, I think the tunnel portal now looks as much a part of the landscape as anything else on Endor, which is satisfying. We've now had confirmation that Apple's new tool Class 56s should be arriving in June, so it won't be long until I have to clear everything up and make sure the track is working well, ready to test my Class 56. The next step I'd like to take with the tunnel is to make its interior walls, roof and textures. With curved track and an arched roof, I don't think it will actually be possible to make any shape on paper that could be used to make or line the roof whilst also curving with the track, so I'll probably have to compromise by making triangular sections. But the tunnel won't necessarily be the next thing I do. I don't actually have any specific plans, but I imagine I'll want to make a first impressions video about the Class 56 once I've had a play with it, and I'm fairly keen to get back to custom decoders before I forget everything I've learned about them. The overall look of the layout would also benefit from a continuation in ballasting and more layers of scatter, so there's no shortage of options. We'll see what happens. That's all for now. Bye bye.